Tamara is on, who set us up together. Hi, Tamara. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Workbar Live. My name is Chelsea Hildreth, the Events and Partnerships Manager at Workbar. It's our pleasure to welcome Kerianne Panos, the founder of MCML Consulting, who will present on engaging communication techniques in a 2D world. To start, just a little bit about the company and Kerianne. MCML Consulting aims to combine the best of both worlds, providing people and organizations with the knowledge and expertise they need to succeed in a multicultural and multilingual world. Kerianne herself is fluent in 8 languages, spent 10 years living in East Asia before moving back to Boston, and has helped over 200 clients, ranging from baseball players to CEOs, to develop their communication skills. We're happy to have her on this topic today. Just a few minutes for our attendees. If you're new to Zoom webinars, you will only be able to see Kerianne and I. It's not like a meeting where everyone is on the full panel. So thank you again, Kerianne, for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and MCML Consulting and what prompted you to start this company?
Sure. So after working a long time in East Asia with a lot of different people, I found that, especially when I was a negotiator and conflict resolution manager, I found that a lot of the issues we were seeing are coming from communication, misunderstandings, miscommunications. And I started thinking about, okay, do different languages communicate in different ways? Do different people think differently because they speak in different languages? And because I can speak languages ranging from US English to UK English to different European languages, some Arabic, and 3 Asian languages, I started seeing patterns. And I thought, okay, if I explain this, maybe I can find a way to minimize some of these communication issues that cause people to get frustrated and upset with each other. I've also seen different management styles cause people to lose their jobs, which I never want to see again. And I've seen how these communication differences across languages and cultures can really push back projects. So if I work with a biotech company, if I work with a pharmaceutical company, they're running clinical trials, we're looking at communication issues that can push a project back 6 months, and that could be millions, if not more, dollars. If we can find a way to prevent these issues from happening, then it really helps the team dynamics. It really helps people to feel more comfortable, trust each other more, and it, at the bottom line, keeps projects on time.
Absolutely, very important. And why do you think that effective communication techniques, especially now that we've shifted to remote work, are so important?
So coming from my background in East Asia, I found that during a meeting, people would often not talk that much. And then after the meeting, they would start to go, oh, by the way, how about this? And oh, by the way, how about that? And have these casual conversations. When we're moving to remote, we don't have that opportunity anymore. Mm-hmm. We all know that during the meeting, yes, we get the official business done, but after the fact, we always have something that we remember. Before, we could just go easily to the person and say, oh, hey, by the way, what about this? Oh, hey, what about that? You could have that conversation at the end of the meeting, right? Walking somewhere, moving somewhere else. We've lost that ability to have spontaneity. And so now we need to be even more careful of making sure that we all communicate during the meetings.
Well, thank you very much for explaining all of that. I will let you get started by giving us the tips on one-on-one communication techniques in this 2D world that most of us aren't really used to.
Mm-hmm. So because I work with clients from everywhere in the world, I've been working on Zoom, Skype, Google Hangouts, Line, WeChat for a long time. And I find that some people don't like to watch themselves on the screen. So one of the things is, when it's confusing, right? So if I'm talking, I'm kind of looking at you, I'm looking at myself, I'm looking at that little dot where it says my video is on all at the same time, and you lose that focus, right?
Right.
So one thing that some of my clients like to do is if you actually go onto gallery view and you look at your picture and there's 3 dots at the top right corner, you can stop video, so that you only see the other person. So one thing is when we're distracted, right? If we're in a 3D world, right, I'm going to completely focus on you. I'm going to focus on your body language. But if we're in a 2D world, I'm getting distracted. And
Right.
then sometimes I'm looking up, sometimes I'm looking down. And if I'm looking at you right now, what you can see is my head is turned down already. Yeah?
Right.
So sometimes actually taking that video off or pushing the screen up as high as possible to make sure that you're looking as close to the camera, but still also kind of toggling back to the person, that's quite important. Another thing is a lot of people, especially in the more technical fields, have multiple screens going at the same time. So another thing I've noticed is that they have one screen to look at the video and then another screen to type. And what they're doing is as soon as they start typing, they're talking to the side. And I think a lot of people don't realize it. But most of I've got lots of engineers, scientists, researchers, and I don't think they realize it, but they're sort of always looking to the side and typing. So we
Right.
want to also make sure that it makes sense to type, but don't multitask. When you're talking, talk. And if you need to listen and type, and if you need to avert your gaze while you're typing, that makes sense. Some people need to take notes in real time. Take those notes. But when you are talking, make sure that you're looking at the person. That contact is very important. We get a lot of nuance from the eye contact, from just small gestures like nodding, from a little bit of kind of movement of the upper body, because all we are little boxes right now.
Right.
So because we're missing, right, we're all just tiny boxes, right? So, in the tiny box world, what can you do, right? So you've got a little bit of movement in your shoulders, you've got head movement. We don't want to do too much because then you look like a bobblehead nodding up and down too much.
Right.
We want to kind of avoid the bobblehead effect here. At the same time, one thing I do talk to a lot of my clients about is trying to speak a little bit more clearly than you normally would. So when we get excited, when we get interested in something, when we have a strong opinion, we all tend to speak quickly. We're excited, right? We're more emotional. We're like, oh, this is a good idea. Yeah. Now, that's great in 3D because I know the other person is guaranteed to hear it. In 2D, we can't guarantee this. The bandwidth is always now lower because everybody's working from home. Our connections are going to be unstable from time to time.
Right.
So if we can take it a little bit slower and a little bit clearer, even if there's a time where the connection isn't perfect, it's more likely to get the message across the first time. And if you are having trouble, the chat function is great. And there's a couple of other things I'll talk about when we get to larger meetings. But
Right.
if you are having trouble, you can always go back and use the chat function as well.
Well, you just mentioned techniques for larger meetings. So can you now give our audience techniques on communicating via large meetings or webinars? How can the host, panelist, or presenter best keep the room engaged? I know I'm interested to hear this.
So that's actually it's much harder. I think one-on-one is a lot easier. So right now, I would normally work with some of our larger groups in person, but now I've got about 12, 15 people groups that I'm working with on Skype. And in my case, I've got a very international audience, so I have to pay extra attention. One thing I find is actually, if possible, if you have an added camera that they can zoom in and out, what I recommend actually is zooming out just a little bit, okay? And if you're speaking and you're talking to multiple people, a little bit of zoom out, it says to the rest of the group that you're the presenter.
Okay.
It's a little bit of space difference. It says, I'm going to present, and now it's time for you to listen. So if you're facilitating or leading a meeting at the beginning, you might want to actually have a little bit of distance. And it's like a subliminal message to the people like, oh, okay, she or he is going to speak now. All right, we're going to listen. And then as you move in for the discussion, you can actually physically move in a little bit more. So as we're working I look at more kind of US English culture since we're here in Boston. In a more US English culture, we have one-way communication and two-way communication. So if I want to communicate in a one-way, I'm going to take a little bit more distance. I'm going to speak a little bit more slowly, a bit more clearly, a stronger voice, and a little bit more body language. So all of these are saying to the multiple people watching, okay, this person is in command of the conversation. I'm going to listen. I'm going to focus for now.
Interesting. And I know you had mentioned utilizing the tools. I know we're using Zoom today, but I'm sure there's a ton of different platforms. So maybe if you could touch on a couple ones that you have experience with, that would be great.
So if we're using Zoom, because a lot of people are using Zoom here, because you can do things like share screen. If you're editing on a document, you can get the remote control function, which is great. So two people can edit at the same time. If you click on the participants, then different kind of icons pop up, like a yes or a no or a raise hand or a slow down or speed up. You also have the reactions in the bottom panel for Zoom, where you can do a thumbs up, where you can do a clap. You can do polls, you can do Q&As. So I like using all of these online tools, especially if the meeting involves a more international audience. I find these to be very helpful. So for the people I work with, when I start a meeting that's multiple people, we have a couple of ground rules that I set. So one, if I'm giving a presentation, making a few points, I want to make sure that people are following. So we actually use the thumbs up. And I have everybody use the thumbs up to make sure that everybody is following. Because in my case, I'm going to have different time zones on the same meeting. And I'm never completely sure about the bandwidth and about the connection. So I'm using that to check. If somebody doesn't understand, I have them do the raise hand so I can see it. And that way we can keep the conversation going, we can keep the flow going, and then I can paraphrase, I can shorten, or I can simplify my message. So in a 2D world, my ultimate goal is to keep the flow of the conversation normal. We can't get 100%. I don't think it's possible. I think we're losing about in terms of body language, movement, kind of tone of voice. We're missing some of those kind of unconscious factors, that we use to understand what the other person feels and perceives about the situation. So 80% is my goal. Okay. And I've given up 100 a long time ago. It's too hard. It's just too much effort. Right? So what does 80% mean is that we have the audience is understanding all of my main points. They're understanding the key details. They're providing me feedback in terms of the reactions. They're providing me feedback in terms of, slow down or say this point over again. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to keep the basic pace the same, if not just a little bit slower, and then using these other tools, including chat, if someone needs to clarify something, to make sure that we feel like we're still in a conversation.
Right.
We feel like the discussion keeps on going, but we have places where people can give their input quietly.
Right.
Because you have 10 plus people in a meeting and someone doesn't understand, you just have a random voice, right? All of a sudden you don't know who it is, you can't see all of the images. In gallery view, you can, but if you're working on a document, which is often the case, then they're on a side panel and it's very hard to see who's talking. Right. So I'm trying to use those quieter tools to make sure that people can give the input so that we don't have people talking over each other, which does happen in the 3D world, but it's much harder in the 2D world when you start to have one person talking over the other person. Right. It's much harder to course correct in a 2D world than a 3D world in this case.
Understood. I do have a question here.
Sure.
And, as you're talking about engagement, I encourage people to submit their questions. They are asking, what's the best way to show engagement while you're doing a lot of the listening? I would assume that means in meetings where you have audio on, but maybe you're not one of the biggest participants in the meeting. I think if you could speak to that, that would be great.
Sure, and that's the tough part. So we all know that we have, like, I think update meetings are probably one of the hardest things actually in the 2D world, because you have one person who's really presenting and the other people are mainly listening. And then when you mute to make sure that, right, if you have any background noise, right, that doesn't come out. Many of us have kids at home. We're trying to manage a lot of different things. And if you tell your kid, if you have, a young kid at home and you tell them to be quiet, they don't listen.
Right.
They're going to do what they want to do. So you're muted and you're sort of also distracted at the same time. So the engagement part is harder than normal. And that's one of the things that when you turn on mute, your brain thinks, oh, I don't have to focus as much. So one of the ways to show that you're engaged as a listener is you can certainly kind of doing the nodding. Mm-hmm. What you can also do, you can use chat actually quite well, and you can provide sort of short comments as well. So I have a client who really likes to do, he leads a team of about, he's based in Singapore, but he has a team of 10 throughout Southeast Asia. And because his team is multilingual, multicultural, what they have decided to do is chat comments. So my client will be leading the meeting, and it'll be a weekly update meeting, and the participants or the listeners are giving short comments. See, good point, got it. And comments, my client is looking on the side of chat to see what's going on, and that's how he knows that they're engaged. So you can keep yourself on mute and provide those short comments and say, got it, understood, on the to-do list. All of those things provide reinforcement that you're engaged in listening, but it doesn't.
We lost you for that last sentence that you said.
Okay. I told you 80%, right?
Right.
So what we want to do is engage, okay, without stopping the flow of the conversation. That's why I think the chat is a good function to use more actively.
Yes, and actually, someone is asking, how can you keep tracking comments in chat from getting distracting, like I'm doing right now, taking your presentation? I think that would be good to comment on.
Mm-hmm. So it is a little bit distracting at the beginning to follow the comments. But another thing that I do is that's one of those ground rules, so that you can say, I want to make sure, during the meeting that we're all staying engaged, so that I'd like to use the chat function actively. So I may kind of toggle back and forth to talk and then look at the chat. It's one of those things where you set it up at the beginning. So with the 2D world, there's going to be a little bit of artificiality, and we can't prevent that from happening. And so we need to have certain special ground rules or certain kind of measures that we put at the beginning, which get us to the 80%.
Nicola is asking, when your video is on, should you look at the video light or straight at the person in the center of the screen? So I'm like, right now I'm looking at you. I'm not looking at my camera light. What's the best approach?
Okay, so that's a good question. And now I'd say the best. Okay, so let me do it this way. We better engage when we're looking right at the person. This is why I advise to use the speaker view, so that the other person gets quite at large, and then remove your own video. And that way, the other person's image is as close to your video as possible. And so that way you don't have to look up and down. So I find that looking at my own video, I'm doing it right now because I want to make sure that I'm clear with everybody, but I find it's kind of distracting. And so I remove my video completely, make the other person bigger, and so that there's maybe 1 inch difference between where my camera is and where the person's face is. And that's so minimal that your person wouldn't realize that you're actually not looking directly at them. it wouldn't make a difference that way.
Oh, interesting. Okay. While people are still submitting questions, I'm sure that you've been asked a variety of questions from your clients throughout the years.
Mhm.
Can you give us a few examples of those and the best practices that go with them?
Sure, sure. So in my case, I'm maybe hyper aware of how I'm speaking to make sure that people are following. I say one of the most important things is we can't guarantee how clear the signal is going to be. Even if we have high speed internet, this is a crazy time, and so many people are using their internet at home, and we all know that our internet at home is nowhere near as powerful as our internet in the office.
Right.
So I would say resist the urge to talk too much if possible. I know that it's hard,
Yeah.
but as I'm talking with you, I'm giving you a couple of sentences. So instead, I'm trying to keep my message a little bit shorter than normal. I'm watching the other person's reaction. I'm making sure they're following. And then I'm going on to my next major point. So there's a little pause or a short delay when I speak. This is very hard to do.
Yeah, we're not trained like that normally. That's not how.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I trained as an interpreter, so my brain is sort of primed to do that.
Right.
But I would say this is one of the hardest things for people to do. When they get excited, they just keep talking. And then if you miss 30 seconds, you can't remember what you said and you've lost a valuable point. Right. So a little bit of extra caution, a little bit of extra preparation will prevent that problem from happening after the fact. Another thing is, if we have a more international audience, and I know our Workbar members, have connections around the world, everybody knows to speak slower, sure. But I have a couple of clients who also use chat very actively to write out some of their main points as well. Or because Zoom has a great function where you can share the screen, I have another group of people who type their main points right on the screen on a file that they're using to make sure that the other side is following along.
Oh, that's an interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So you could, if you're using Skype, this works. If you're using Zoom, this works. WebEx works as well, but Google Hangouts and FaceTime don't allow for the sharing, which is why I use it less for work. Yeah, I use those really for friends. Mm-hmm. Gotcha. But anywhere where you have screen sharing, you can do live notes and live key points. And I find that, I think that it's kind of like having a live meeting agenda. And I think that's great to have anyway, no matter what. But especially if you have different sites, different departments, we have international sites coming together, then writing these things out, writing these main points out is really helpful. I worked with a company, an international biotech, who they would always do live notes between their key Asia hub and their US hub, because the Asia hub was having difficulty sometimes following the US when they had internal communications and internal conversations during the meeting. So they would always write their key points out, and that we could make sure that 60% was definitely understood during the meeting.
Excellent. And if someone else has a question, yep. They want to know, what are the most awkward things you've seen people do with 2D communication? On Zoom, I assume on Skype or Google Hangouts, any platform.
Okay, so one of my favorite ones is when people start talking without taking the mute button off.
Yes.
Where they just like, and I'm going, and then you have 5 people, and the person doesn't see it. Luckily with Zoom, you can unmute the other person if they could. But the unmute is probably the most common thing I've seen. Also, sometimes we have fidgeters. Mm-hmm. So we have the fidgeters who like do this and then do this, and they're kind of fidgety, and they're kind of doing things with their hands and moving around. The fidgeters are very distracting. And then one other thing, some people kind of move, they do this in their chair without realizing it.
Oh yeah, if you have a spinny chair.
The spinny chair people. So people have certain habits that in a 3D world you would completely overlook. But in the 2D world, they become distracting and frustrating for the other person.
Right.
Maybe one other one is very big hands. Usually if I'm talking, I do like to use my hands a lot. I kind of keep them in front of me and below my chin if possible. So in a 3D world, this, yes, okay. But in a 2D world, you can see how distracting this is.
Right.
So using your hands, I think, is great. Just one of the things I learned from being a Japanese speaker is keep your elbows in. If you keep your elbows in, then your hands can go only up to your chin. And then you can use a lot of hand gestures kind of in this area where it's not distracting for your face, but where I can actually provide a lot of information.
Right.
I can emphasize a point. I can say, hey, I can say, sure. So I can use a lot of different kind of subtle cues with my hands, but they don't distract from my face. So key point is keep your elbows in. Feel free to use your hands, but watch out that they don't go in front of your face.
Right.
Because then that actually reduces volume, and I'm losing a lot of great information, facial expressions, gestures, things like that.
Okay, thank you. I'm just trying to check if there's any other questions. Doesn't look like it. So I guess to just wrap up, for those of us joining today, what are the biggest takeaways that we would, need to know from your presentation? You've given us a lot of useful information, but if you could say 3 or 4 kind of bigger points, what would they be?
Sure. So clear communication is the most important thing. Speak a little bit slower than you're used to, and watch out for how much you speak at one time. Make sure you get some feedback from the other person before you continue, because we never know when the signal is going to cut out.
Right. Of course.
Yep. Second one is for a one-on-one meeting, really, if possible, remove your own screen, make the other person's screen, make the other person look bigger, and really focus on the eye contact, focus on using these gestures, focus on using your expression to make sure you're really conveying more, because we always lose something when it goes from 3D to 2D. And so a little bit extra focus on how we are engaging with each other really then minimizes that gap. And then the third thing is for the larger meetings, if you're presenting, pull back a little bit, show that you're the presenter. And then as you're facilitating discussion, move back in and use your tools. You can use your claps, you can use your thumbs up, you can use your raised hand, and use your chat. Really use your chat effectively. A lot of people forget about it, but it can be a great tool to make sure that all of your listeners, all of the participants are engaged and they're actively commenting, even if it's just a got it, will do on the to-do list. All of those small things can make you feel very reassured that both sides are actively participating, even in a larger meeting.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I know that all of these tips have been very helpful. Suzanne even said a huge thank you from me. This is incredibly helpful. So thank you. And again, we can't thank you enough for being here. I'm sure that everyone is going to be utilizing these and implementing them in their next meetings. Someone before you go wants to know virtual backgrounds, do's and don'ts, which I've seen a lot of interesting things out there. So I think that's a very valid question.
Okay. Well, I have just given everyone my email and my cell phone. Feel free to text me, phone me, email me at any time. Yes, thank you. That's the one thing I forgot. So thank you, whoever mentioned that. So I have, okay. So couple things. Both Chelsea and I, we have these light background rooms. Okay. And I have a dedicated office, and that's on a different floor from where my family is. And so it's quite quiet. But some people, we all know, spaces at a premium in Cambridge, Somerville, all of Massachusetts. So not everybody has that luxury. So if you feel that you don't want to show your space, I'm fine with a virtual background. The one thing is, it doesn't work as well depending on how long your hair is. It sounds kind of strange, but if I, for example, put on, all right, we'll do a couple different things so we can see this. All right, if I do a very dark background, this does not work. And you can see the outline of my hair in my hands. It's very, very awkward. Okay. I've seen a couple other people do something like this with this kind of background.
Right.
With the skyline of Boston. You could do something like that, or you can do, even like a wallpaper background of a neutral color, for example. Let's see. This is one of the Zoom ones, but it's a lighter color. So if you do a background, I would say try to keep it light. Try to keep it one color. You can see that it is distracting to have this in the background. And also, if you have hair that moves around, and if you have hands that move around, you can see that it's distracting. So my recommendation is, if possible, use a regular background. If not, do try to find a light colored background, like a kind of a white or a beige or maybe a light green, so that you can pop, so that the face comes out more clearly when you're talking. So a lot of people have these white or light gray walls, and that allows for a nice contrast between the wall color and the person. So any background that allows for that nice contrast, I think is fine, especially if you live in a small space and you don't want people to see your home.
Okay, awesome. All right. Well, I think with that, if no one else has any other questions, Kerianne did put here, just to remind you that what her email is and what her phone number is. So please write that down, because I think it goes away once
You can also save the chat, everybody.
Oh, there you go.
So one other feature, if you want to save the chat, at the bottom right of the chat, where it's all panelists, you have the 3 dots. There's a save chat function. So you can definitely also save the chat as well, which is a nice feature of Zoom.
Awesome. All right. Well, Kerianne, thank you again so much for your help today. We look forward to hearing more from you and seeing you over at Cambridge. Kerianne is one of our Cambridge members. And for all of our attendees, please remember to look out for the information on next week's sessions. Again, Kerianne, thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, everyone.